Good evening and welcome to Shakespeare and Company. Thank you all for coming out on this very gloomy Parisian evening. We're delighted to welcome Philip Hoare to Shakespeare and Company tonight. Nobody writes as compellingly about the sea as Philip Hoare. First in Leviathan or the Whale, winner of the 2009 Samuel Johnson Prize for Non-Fiction, then The Sea Inside, and now Rising Tide, Falling Star. Philip Hoare conveys the beauty and immensity, but also the raw power and indifference of the oceans and the creatures that inhabit them with an unmatched elegance and passion. And why? Perhaps because as someone who rarely goes a day without a wild swim, Philip Hoare is practically a sea creature himself. But Rising Tide, Falling Star is not a book limited by the conventions of nature writing. It is at once also a memoir, a travelogue, and literary biography in which the author is carried from one subject to the next by a logic that is, like the ocean currents themselves, invisible to the reader, yet also irresistible in its force. Percy Shelley, Virginia Woolf, Wilfred Owen, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Henry David Thoreau, among many, many others, their stories tied together by their connection, sometimes literal, sometimes psychical, to the sea, told through both sweeping gazes to distant horizons and breathtaking plunges to the abyss. In addition to his 3 watery books, Philip Hoare is the author of many other works, including Serious Pleasures, The Life of Stephen Tennant, Noel Coward, Oscar Wilde's Last Stand, Spike Island, and England's Lost Eden. You'll not be surprised to hear that he lives on the coast in Southampton. Esquire called Rising Tide, Falling Star a swirling poetic reverie, and BBC Radio 4 said it was wonderful, beautifully written, a delight, while The Observer simply wrote, Rising Tide, Falling Star is a masterpiece. Please join me in welcoming Philip Hoare to Shakespeare and Company.
Thank you.
So to give people, I guess, a little taste of what to expect from Rising Tide, Falling Star, we're going to begin with a short reading.
Yeah. Do you mind if I stand up? Am I allowed to do that? Sorry, just because I read better. Okay, yeah, I'll go to there. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Out of the darkness, obscure noises drift from the docks, booming over the water. The red lights of the power station chimney blink like an industrial lighthouse, summoning and warning. You can be what you want to in the dark. For me, it used to be nightclubs under London streets. Now it's another nocturnal performance. An hour before dawn, before the light starts to stain the summer sky violet, I ride back to the beach. Foxes sidle out of the woods and rabbits flash their white scuts at the approach of my bike light. High in the trees over the shore, a pair of tawny owls converse in screeches. Crows hang in the branches, all angular tails and beaks, as if they'd been born out of the bowls. All these creatures own this place in the interregnum of the dark. They should not be anywhere else. No one could have told you when you were young what would happen. They didn't dare. It's enough to realise that what we have lost is still ahead of us. I see things that are not there. One magical moment, I feel like a penitent. The sea is so still, it seems like a sin to break its surface. But I do. Swimming at night with a diminished sense of sight only makes the act more sensual. You feel the water around you. You lose yourself in its sway. Fish bite me, leaving loving grazes. I turn on my back, watching the stars fall. I first saw it slumped on the weedy slipway one afternoon. A deer sprawled at the high water mark. It looked perfect, lying there, thrown up by the tide, staring glassy-eyed to the sky. Had it died trying to swim across from the forest? Or had it slipped and fallen, cloven hooves clattering on concrete with panic in its eyes? Perhaps it had been shot, although there was no wound in its russet pelt. The next day, someone had hauled out this sea deer, this antlered seal, and impaled it on the spikes of the metal railings. It hung there by its neck, dangling as a warning, in the way farmers nail dead owls, wings outstretched to barn doors. I wanted to relieve it of this indignity, to take it down from its cross, but I hadn't the strength. So I waited to see what happened next. The following day, it reappeared on the shore as if it had climbed down overnight. It was accompanied by a carrion crow, tentatively but intimately pecking away at the flesh, performing the last rites. I wished the bird well and a good breakfast. I'd forgotten about the carcass when, a week later, I came across its remains in the surf. By now the body had been reduced to a single strand of vertebrae, picked clean by crabs and gulls. It was down to its essential scaffolding, its skeletal beauty twisted like the ghost of a horned sea serpent lolling in the water. The stubby antlers sprouted from the bulbous, rough-edged rings on the forehead. Caught between them was a scrap of fetlock-like fur. Skeins of grey flesh still hung about the skull, scrappily attached to the white bone. I had to have it, this grotesque piece of flotsam, something to add to the pile back home, the fragments of blue and white china, the clay pipes with the blooms still on them, the shards of misty sea glass, the chunks of green glazed medieval pots, the stones pierced with holes. Using a bit of driftwood to hold down the spine, I pulled at the antlers, twisting and wrestling with them as with a bull. It occurred to me, as I did so, how easy it would be to detach a human head. With a stagger, I succeeded in wrenching off my trophy, my prize for having watched so patiently. I had to gouge out a gelatinous eye before stuffing the skull into a plastic bag and tying it to the back of my bike. I rode away from the beach, passing walkers who wouldn't guess at my cargo. Back home, I opened a hole in the warm brown earth and buried the head up to its antlers. They stood proud of the soil like a pruned rose bush. I piled rocks on top to guard against predators and went back indoors to wait till the antlers sprouted and grew like branches, and as below the surface the skull grew roots which became bones, its lost vertebrae, femurs and ribs all restored, ready to rear up out of the earth, a resurrected, newly grown deer of my own.
Wow, that's a very striking piece too.
I was a very timid young boy when I was. I can't imagine what has, in my late middle age, I'm wrenching bits of animal off.
It's funny you should say that, actually, because I think this is kind of your third watery book in a way. And even though I think, of course, all of these three books, Leviathan, The Sea Inside, and Rising Tide, Falling Star, can be read independently. Having read Leviathan and The Sea Inside, we do notice a development in you. Anyone who's familiar with your voice and also with your sort of life experience will be, well, I guess quite a surprise from the Philip Hoare we meet at the beginning of Leviathan and the Philip Hoare we find in Rising Tide, Falling Star, which, as you say, is somebody who, I mean, I rather insolently said you were like almost a sea creature yourself, but you seem to have, over this period of writing these three books, really, the sea has become such an important part of your life. Yeah,
I think it's because it's that real intention to be physically engaged with one's subject. I mean, I started out writing biographies, wrote this biography of this aesthete from the 1920s, Stephen Tennant, who was the lover of Siegfried Sassoon, patron of Cecil Beaton. He knew Virginia Woolf, Ian Forster, Willa Cather very well. He was very much part of that kind of scene, which was quite a decadent, epicene, social thing. And that really appealed to me at that point in time when I was coming out of punk. I was very much part of the punk scene in London, and I was very much, I was living a an underground life in nightclubs, as I say. So the idea of this aesthete who wore sort of Vaseline on his eyelids and gold dust sprinkled in his hair and chinchilla fur coat collars and drove about London in an electric broom, which was like a shop window on top of a carriage, really. He was like a Warholian superstar, you know. He was famous just for being famous. And that kind of segued into Noel Coward and then writing about Wilde as well, and this idea of celebrity and all the things which I'd found very glamorous when I was a teenager, growing up quite like you. I think we both grew up in South Coast towns next to each other, and the idea of this impossible glamour, you know, which was intangible and very far away from the suburbs in which we lived, was always very tantalising. And then to suddenly find myself actually sitting next to aristocrats and talking to Lucian Freud and David, you know, coming home to answer phone messages from David Hockney, and then being invited by Katharine Hepburn to come and visit her in a East Side house, a brownstone in Manhattan, where she said, "You look terribly thin. You need to be fed." And she opened this huge 1950s American fridge and got out a half-open tin of crab meat. And I just thought, as you can see the headline now, minor English writer dies of food poisoning in Katharine Hepburn's house. That was but what I felt that when I was writing about those people, that the idea of being objective was really missing out the story, which is part of the story is me being there to witness these things and to witness these stories and the way they are connected. We were talking earlier about this sense of connection. And so when I met Stephen Tennant, when I shook Stephen Tennant's hand, I was shaking the hand of someone who is the lover of Siegfried Sassoon, who of course was the patron of Wilfred Owen and who had very well acquainted with Robbie Ross, who was Wilde's first lover, male lover. So these ways that you become connected throughout the 20th century, these strange sort of like the roots of the deer that I'm imagining, they reach back in history, jumping over periods of time, and that's what became most interesting to me. And then I think you can only do that really from a very personal point of view, unless you're writing fiction like you. I do kind of, in a way, the me that is in these three books especially is becoming increasingly fictionalizing what Philip Hoare is writing.
And yet sort of in these earlier books you've talked about, like the sea seems such a distant a distant thing from the subject matter, from the lives. I mean, obviously, you've got these kind of cosmopolitan lives, and yet when we open Rising Tide, Falling Star, I mean, it's clear that it's essential to your life. It's a central sort of, it's almost like the point around which your life seems to turn now. And can you just talk a little bit about that sort of that transition, sort of how and why that happened?
Well, it's even only on the plane coming here did I realise what this book's about. It's really funny how that happens. I'm sure you know that.
The world premiere now. Then what is this book about?
What it's about, really? Well, what is it about? I don't know what it's about, but and it is about that set. The book opens with a wreck. With a wreck of a life and the wreck of a beach. And the beach is the beach from which I swim every day. I didn't learn to swim until I was nearly 30. I am scared shitless of the sea. And yet I go in it every day now, the past week, because where the tide falls, I go in at 4 o'clock in the morning on a winter's morning in the dark. Sometimes there's snow on the beach, you know, into this sun. And what I've realised, this is a confrontation of my own fears. You know, I'm not brave about this stuff. You know, I do stupid things and swim in stupid conditions in a way, but that's because I consider myself quite a weak person. So it's a kind of challenging myself. But really, I suppose, so what this book is really about is, it starts with the beach the beach from which I swim, which is very close to where I grew up. It's just about a mile away. It's an industrial waterway. It's Southampton Water. It's not the Côte d'Azur. You know, it's grimy. It's a lot of container ships going up and down. Someone here knows it very well, I think, nodding, or maybe. But it's not a pretty place. And I like the edginess of that, and I like like the fact that my relationship to nature there is very much with animals which are kind of having to live alongside human beings, that their cultural history exists contemporaneously with human beings. In fact, probably predates them. You know, like the Brent geese that arrived there from Siberia, migrating all the way from Siberia to this grubby industrial shore, and to swim for me, and it sounds really pompous, but it's a meditative act. It's not an act. I'm not running a marathon, and people tell me you should be careful. Well, we are far too full of cares in our world, and they tell me I should take a mobile phone. Well, I don't have a mobile phone, and anyway, where are you going to put it? Tuck it into a Speedos. I actually don't wear Speedos, so I couldn't even do that. So all those things. It's about that kind of physical challenging. Well, I think the other thing really, and it's a lot to do with this extreme creature which haunts me in the way that haunts Melville and many other people. I think one of the interesting things that I discovered when I was writing Rising Tide, Falling Star was to realise how Virginia Woolf was obsessed with Moby Dick. She read it at least 3 times. That's not an easy thing to do. She owned 2 copies. And she speaks of this haunting image of a distant fin far out. And it's an image of her creativity, but also her tentative grip on sanity. And so that sense of an animal which embodies the vastness of this unknown sea, the kind of fear that inculcates. One of the presiding images that prevented me from learning to swim, even though I was born next to the sea, was that my mother told me about my grandfather who'd come back from the First World War. He'd fought in India in the First World War, and he was a builder, and he built a house for his family. My grandmother. I never knew my grandfather. He died before I was born. I never knew this house. But my mother told me along the side of the big Victorian bath, he painted a big spouting whale. And that image for me connected my fear of the water to the extent that actually I didn't like taking a bath. I mean, it was crazy. And if I saw a book, which my children's encyclopedias, which had pictures of like all these strange anglerfish from the benthic deep, those strange animals with the bioluminescent sort of lures on them, I couldn't even touch the picture. If I had to turn the page, my fingers like that, because I felt if I touched the page, I'd be dragged down into the abyss. I had a very overactive imagination, as you can tell.
Although at one moment in the book you say, I had an overactive imagination, but what use is an underactive one?
Exactly.
And I think that's actually a sort of very pertinent point for the way this book is constructed, in a way, because before we actually come on to talk really about the content, some of the biographies you write and the memoir that you write as well, there's something almost impossible to pin down about the construction of the book, and I guess maybe looking at it from a sort of writing perspective as well, which is sort of I'd like to hear you talk about how a book like Rising Tide, Falling Star develops, which is it's a book which is full of connections and sort of overlapping of whether of lives or of thematics or of locations, and yet I just cannot imagine how you might sit down and begin a book like Rising Tide, Falling Star. So could you talk a little bit about the genesis of it and how it evolved?
It's because there's no moment that you sit down and do it. It starts happening before you've even know it's happening. And because a lot of the book is related to physical activity, physical encounters. So physical encounters with the residue of memory. So, for instance, one very strong character in the book is Wilfred Owen. And I discovered Wilfred Owen actually swam from the same beach I swim from. When he was shell-shocked in France during the First World War, he was shipped back to this vast military hospital on the shores of Southampton Water, a place called Netley. And he talks about this weird disconnect. He can still hear the sounds of the guns from France, but he's in this kind of suburban sort of resort almost. It's like a kind of spa almost, yet it's full of men without legs and arms and men who've lost their minds to the war. And it's very little known about Owen, how important, as for what Wolfe, the water was for him. Swimming for Wilfred Owen was an absolute non-negotiable part, so non-negotiable part of his life that even on manoeuvres, he always finds some water to swim in, a river, a lake, or the sea. The last thing he ever did in Britain before leaving for France and his last journey here to France and when he died was to swim in Folkestone Beach, before he gets the cross-channel ferry. And he's launched into the mire and mud of the Western Front, and he talks about how he has to oil his soldiers' feet with whale oil, and that they've actually stolen life jackets from the cross-channel ferries so that if they fall into the shell holes, they don't drown. So, and then Owen, but this really, really is a complete, excuse the word, mindfuck for Owen, because his water is the saving water, it's the health, healing water. It's the water that, he has loved ever since he was a boy. And it's also a sensuality because it's connected with his own desires, his unspoken desires, because it's quite strange, actually. Every time Owen goes to the beach or he finds a river, there's a handsome young man suddenly walks out like sort of Daniel Craig out of the water. And there's a definite homoerotic charge to that for Owen. So the perversion of nature that is the First World War, the way that the First World War is the first war of the Anthropocene. It's the first war that, we are slaughtering whales, slaughtering human beings, slaughtering horses, and as we discussed before, Wilfred Owen's great mentor, Cephas Soon, is taken aside by someone who says to him, "You know why this war is being fought? It's being fought for Mesopotamian oil wells." 1917. 1917. The way history and time just kind of collapse sometimes. My father was born in 1915, before the battle, just the year before the Battle of the Somme. He lived to have a son who was a punk with peroxide hair, and then my nephew is now cognizant of all that history. The way history collapses, and it all collapses into your mobile phone now, and the way the stuff comes out of that. The fact that, my father was dealing with someone who would be going to see the Sex Pistols, yet he was born the year before the Somme. Those strange things, and it's the key text, the opening text in the Rising Tide, Falling Star is The Tempest, because The Tempest is an extraordinary piece of time-travelling magical realism where Prospero, he talks about what seest thou in the backward abysm of time. And it's as though he's like this John Dee character who's looking into his crystal ball and seeing backwards and forwards. And that's what art does.
When you said crystal ball, then I almost felt you were going to say mobile phone at the moment. You said he was looking into his crystal ball. Yeah. But that's the idea of sort of collapsing time is definitely something one feels when reading Rising Tide, Falling Star. But since you brought up Owen, and I think we'll hear a little bit reading of the extract about him in a moment, another thing I think it does... It's almost ironic in a way that in having this sort of this focus of the sea and sort of bringing in people who have connections to it, it gives us a perspective on people that whether either we feel we know or which have sort of, like, for example, Wilfred Owen, like growing up in the UK, sort of every school child will study his poetry. And I realised while reading this, I knew nothing about his life. There's not a single thing, apart from the fact he fought and died in the First World War and wrote poetry. And it's just fascinating to me that you can sort of use this, the sea as a way to sort of giving a different perspective and a different angle on Wilfred Owen and the other people you write about.
Absolutely. They are connected by the physical sensuality and fluidity of the water. And, I mean, Owen, as you say, it's... the way he's been portrayed by history, it's quite interesting. The image that we all have of Owen is that quite sort of gothic almost image of his shaded, sort of very dark shadow face, staring eyes, a bit sort of like a sort of a Mona Lisa stare, and when I went to his archives of his letters and papers in Oxford, it's completely different. It's this... it's a glamorous young man, has a rosy glow. He's got a tan. He always had a tan because he was always outside. He was, in other photographs, he's smiling, It doesn't suit history to have Wilfred Owen smiling. It doesn't suit history to think of him as being gay, to be honest. For many people, that doesn't work. It doesn't work because he's a patriotic. Well, he's not because he's a war protester, but he's the voice of that war. And we can't see that. So, shall I read a little bit about Owen, just because he is quite strong. And of course, Wilfred Owen was very influenced by Oscar Wilde. When I talk about wild swimming, I'm talking about Oscar. I've lost it. As he got nearer the front, Owen was physically assailed by the noise. It both repelled him and drew him on. His duty was to minister to his men much as he had ministered to the parish of Dunsdon. Quotes, and this very day I knelt down with a candle and watched each man perform his last anointment with whale oil. Like a priest at the Mass of the Last Supper, he supervised them as they prepared for the flooded trenches by rubbing their bare feet with rendered down blubber. For these men, their future condition would be amphibian. This was a fearful morning bathe. Owen and his company were sent into the worst conditions on the Western Front, where the land became, quotes, an octopus of sucking clay, end quotes, navigable only by aquatic duckboards. Bomb craters were bottomless lakes in which men drowned. Others only managed to extract themselves by leaving their equipment and even their clothes behind. A weird Stanley Spencer scene of resurrection, white bodies reborn out of primordial mud. These were warriors dressed to fish for some evil prey. It was a nightmarish version of those seaside days for Owen. He was weighed down, sinking, not swimming. Water had become protean and terrible, as it had for Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and her memory of her drowned brother, evoked in Aurora Leigh, quotes, when something floats up suddenly out there, turns over, a dead face, known once alive, end quotes. Arriving in the bombed-out village of Boucher, Wilfred found a copy of Mrs. Browning's collected poems, and in the battered book he underlined a passage from Aurora Leigh, quotes, see the earth, the body of our body, the green earth, indubitably human, like this flesh, end quotes. She was following him into the mire, picking her way through the devastation in her dark crinoline gown. Her words accompanied him as his mind wandered from the primordial mud to his inner ear, quotes, having listened so long to her low singing voice, which can be heard often through the page, and having seen her hair not in a museum case but palpably in visions, end quotes. This was no place for poets. This was nature suborned, perverted, destroyed. Rupert Brooke's clean swimmers wallowed in flooded trenches in their own dung. The countryside looked more like the blackened mud and debris left on the beach at low tide, with explosive shells instead of their marine equivalents, and the buried dead constantly disinterred by each new wave of fighting. It was an inundated deathscape no silence film could record, although perhaps Shelley had foreseen this apocalypse, in which machines spewed protean fire and raptors pecked our heroes' bones. The men shook, spewed and shat themselves in fear. At one point, the sentry Owen had posted at the top of the tunnel was hit and came tumbling back the steps, quotes, sploshing in the flood, deluging muck, end quotes. He was not dead, but he could not see. "Oh, sir, my eyes, I'm blind, I'm blind." Owen held a candle to his face, telling him if he could see, quotes, the least blurred light, end quotes, he'd be all right. But he sobbed his reply, "I can't," quotes. His eyeballs, huge bulged like squids, end quotes, would haunt Owen for the rest of his life. what's really interesting is Owen is continually using aquatic imagery to portray that the otherness of what's going on, what he's witnessing.
I think there's two things I'd like to talk about. I will open for questions to the audience in about 10 minutes or so, but there's a couple of points that I would like to cover, because they're so... The books are so rich in so many ways, and it's difficult to give sort of a representative idea of what one finds in them. But in the first reading you gave with the image of the skeleton and the skull, it gave us an indication of the role that wildlife plays in your work, and you interestingly spoke about the cultural history of animals, and then certainly in the case of the whale, this is something which one could almost take in a sort of in a literal sense. I mean, from the more we seem to understand these creatures, the more we seem to understand the level and the complexity of their intelligence and their interaction. But it seems that your love of and your obsession with the sea has led to this really in-depth engagement, not only with the sea wildlife, whether that be seals, whether that be seabirds, but also the kind of the mythology surrounding them. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that for us.
Yeah, because I think, it's especially the very freighted figure of the whale, because the whale is you have this extraordinary expanse covering 2/3 of this world's surface, in which 90% of all life resides in the sea. 90% of all biomass on the planet Earth resides in the sea. But it's concealed by what Herman Melville called the ocean skin. And the only way that kind of liminal membrane is broken is by a cetacean normally. It's a whale or a dolphin that kind of moves through that surface and kind of demonstrates what's down there. And the whale, of course, in scale, is suitably huge. He's suitably huge, or she is suitably huge. It's important to address them as she, because they are a matriarchal society. And what's very interesting about these animals that I was obsessed with as a child, I saw my first sort of performing animal in a dolphinarium in Windsor Safari Park, this sort of killer whale sort of leaping out of the water, and ever since then I'd wanted to kind of close that connection, to close the connection between the fascination we feel with these animals and the reality of them. But of course the reality of them is not reality, because I've been in the water with especially sperm whales, which are the whale that Herman Melville talks about. They're the whale which is most hunted. They're the largest predator on Earth. They also possess the largest brain, and they communicate with one another. They exhibit definite sense of culture. They have that brain is highly complex. It's capable, scientists now believe, of complex communication, tool use, and a sense of the abstract self, to the extent that serious biologists hypothesize that sperm whales might have developed their own sense of religion. They have an existential sense of their own selves. I know, it's extraordinary. But if you ever get to share time with a sperm whale, you will realise what very strange creatures they are. They are, they reach, how big? 20 metres long. They are shapeshifters. They change even as you look at them. They change colour from a sort of dove grey to a ebony black to a colour of cocoa. They actually transform themselves to achieve this extraordinary feat of diving for a mile in depth and staying down there for 2 hours. They actually physically transform their bodies. And yet they have this intense social life, which when you're in the water with them, you feel, because they're constantly talking to one another using sonar. So, and each different clans of sperm whales have different accents of click sequences. So, and when you're in the water with them, the first time I was ever in the water with a sperm whale, and this large female sperm whale came swimming towards me. I was in the Azores, very deep water there. From someone who's scared of swimming, this is water is 3 miles deep, and it is full of giant squid and great white sharks. This massive massive creature came swimming directly towards me. And she was obviously curious. And she was coming closer and closer. It was clear she wasn't going to stop. Yeah. At which point I lost control of my bodily functions. And I thought, how rude to come visiting and pee on someone's doorstep. And she kept on coming. And I thought, OK, she's either going to ram into me or open her mouth at the last moment. And that would be my poetic end. Quite a good way to go for someone who's obsessed with the sea. But she didn't. As she approached me, she started going through my skull, my sternum, the whole of my skeletal structure, creating a three-dimensional sound picture of me in her head, which is being back. And I was feeling this. I didn't hear it. I felt it. I felt myself being sectioned like an MRI scanner and being sent back to this whale's head, being comprehended by this. And this is the most extraordinary thing, to be comprehended by another animal who is sentient, because she came up alongside me. She was as closest to me as I could have easily touched her. But generally don't prod people when you first meet them, especially if they're 60-foot whales. And she looked at me with this eye which is the size of a melon. And it wasn't the eye of a dog or a horse. It was absolute sentience. She was trying to read me. And I'd spent sort of 15 years trying to describe a whale, and here was a whale trying to describe me. But then as she dove from the blue into the black, from this wonderful sort of Eve Klein blue of the Atlantic into this profound velvety black, I laughed, because it was so improbable this puny, pathetic suburban boy from Southampton who didn't learn to swim until he was nearly 30 should be in these 3-mile deep waters with this leviathan of a creature, this storied mythological creature who crosses all sorts of boundaries. You know, the whale Melville writes about. Melville, it's very disheartening for any reader who's struggled all the way through Moby Dick, 136 chapters, to be told by Melville, I know him not and I never will. So you just spent 136 chapters telling us about what you don't know anything about. And that's why I say I know nothing about these animals. I've been in the water probably more times than most people have been with animals like this. I was in Sri Lanka with 150 sperm whales in March. 150 sperm whales. They were on spring break. They were basically screwing right underneath us. They go, as Melvin says, they mate ad hominem, like human beings, belly to belly, and they're just going underneath our boat. They just didn't even care. I was in the water with them all day, and but what you realise is that sudden. For a writer to be in a story where you suddenly, the context of all your existence, all your hubris, all your sense of dominion, all your cleverness, all the things you can do, mean nothing. They mean nothing. You know, I talked about the Anthropocene. When we are over, when human beings are over, our geological trace in the strata will be the thickness of a cigarette paper. That's what we will leave behind. That's what we will leave behind. And these animals will continue on.
And this is, I mean, you write so wonderfully about wildlife generally. And in Rising Tide, Falling Star, we have, we have seabirds, we have seals. But it's clear, and I think this was probably just came across, and when you were just talking then, when you're writing about whales, there is this kind of transcendence, which clearly you feel when you're with them. And it's... maybe slightly sort of counterproductive to cite the previous thing, but I think the time with the Azores, is the conclusion of Leviathan, and genuinely, I think one of the most moving passages in any book I've ever read. Like really powerful. Likewise, in Rising Tide, Falling Star, there's when you're out on a boat and there's this sort of, I don't know if we just describe it as a whale party or something, but this kind of explosion of whales through the surface of the water, and again we feel that despite however wonderfully you write about all these other sea creatures, the whale has a very special place in your...
Because it's an alien culture. Because, back at the end of the 1960s, when two rather hippie scientists floated out from the coast of Bermuda and lowered a hydrophone like this, watery hydrophone into the water and recorded the sound of a humpback whale singing, it was the first time we'd heard another culture. We've been sending probes out of the solar system to try and discover extraterrestrial life when it was there all the time, and it was the most extraordinary sound. It's a cliche now. Humpback whale song is a cliche now, but imagine if you'd never heard that before. The man who first discovered it actually was an American scientist who purposely didn't let the secret out about it because he was afraid that Soviet whaling fleets would use this sound to actually hone in on the whales and hunt them. And that sound comes back into Falling Star. It's very much part of the book, and the book sort of ends with that sound.
I can also confirm, because when reading it, I sought out that album, Songs of the Humpback Whale, and don't do it if you've got a cat. I would just say that they don't respond at all well to the sound of a humpback whale. I don't know, there's something sort of primal going on there.
Well, maybe it's because, if you speed up Humpback Whale song, it sounds like birdsong.
Ah, okay.
So maybe that's what they're hearing.
Maybe he was just looking for a very slow bird. So before I open to questions from the audience, I think we will have another reading, but I'd just like to talk about one of the other subjects. And I'm anxious about how we talk about him, because of all of the subjects of the book, he's the one that goes unnamed in a way. I'm not sure best how to approach this. Perhaps with the reading first, and then just a little conversation about it.
This is a short reading. Surely all this is not without meaning, says Ishmael, as he stands looking out over the water while Manhattan rises and falls behind him. Quotes, and still deeper, the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting, mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But the same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. End quotes. Open quotes. She had been a gloomy boy, Woolf wrote of her Orlando, in love with death, as all boys are. We all shudder at our earlier selves and sigh with regret at what we did or did not put them through. Not long ago, a museum curator led me down into the belly of a building, into the conservation studio housed in its basement. Staff were busy tending to various dummies dressed in glamorous outfits from the 20s, each being prepared to take its place in the galleries above. In one corner of the room, a plywood capsule lay propped on trestles like a bier. The curator lifted its curved lid, and inside, under a cloud of tissue, lay a costume shaped from tarnished silver gauze, a frail, glittering suit of armour studded with sunflowers and leaves at the shoulders and hips for some wild in parable. It had been worn in a film in which the Starman played another alien, a Pierrot picking his way over an irradiated beach lapped by a solarized sea. His long white stockings lay beside the outfit, rubbed with dirt. Boxed up and ready to be launched out into the ocean, stiff on its legend and sewn over with sequins and pearls. The outfit all but trembled as I looked at it, as if an aquatic insect had emerged from its chrysalis and flown away. It might have been made of nothing. I could have reached down and touched it, this phosphorescent shroud shaped with his form, no more substantial than the glowing mantle on a gas lamp. But I couldn't make that final connection for fear my dreams would disappear. It was too late. The moment had passed 40 years before. Recently, I heard his voice, inadvertently, on the radio in my kitchen. It was an interview from 1976, and he was speaking as a civilian, as an ordinary person, making jokes. I walked past. It sounded so strange and familiar, so confiding, that for a moment I thought I was listening to myself.
Thank you. The Starman, I think we will leave him unnamed out of respect, but I suspect most people know whom we're talking.
This book was written for him, and the day I was finished the final edit, I was in Cape Cod, and I checked my email at 2 o'clock that morning, which I wouldn't normally do. And it was an email from my sister telling me.
Wow. So finished on... Wow, okay. Because I was going to ask you, that was going to be my question about this, because, of course, he passed away, I assume, during the composition of the book, and I was going to ask if that had changed it. But
no, I mean, I rewrote the end. I didn't rewrite the end. I was... Well, he just came into the end.
Yeah.
Sorry, spoiler alert. But
when I was reading it, I was thinking, and also you made me think of it again a moment earlier when you were talking about sort of growing up in these sort of suburban, sort of glamourless places in a way, and it made me think of a photography exhibition I saw. It was in the British Pavilion of Venice Biennale. Not the last one, but I think the one before, of photos of one of his tours in, I believe it was the Ziggy Stardust tour, in fact, and seeing him on stage in suburban sort of town halls and pavilions, and there was something incredibly melancholy in a way of seeing this sort of almost extraterrestrial presence on these sort of these little stages, which I remember from the time I was growing up in sort of the 80s and 90s, but when now a performer of his caliber would be in very modern arenas, and I wanted to just talk about, because you were talking about what the book was about, and you said that it began with a wreck. And it's certainly the case, I think, that there's a melancholy to this book. I mean, there are several accounts of shipwrecks. There are several accounts of people whose lives end through drowning or end in the sea in some fashion. And I was wondering, was that something which you realised almost while you were writing it, or did that sort of come through later on, that you realised these stories were kind of coalescing around this melancholy?
It's a kind of natural frame of mind. I mean, the thing is that he, the Starman, becomes Prospero. I mean, when I first saw him in a stadium which is called the Empire Pool, Wembley, which was built for the 1934 British Commonwealth Games, Empire Games then. It was a converted swimming pool where I first saw him. And when I saw him, it was just him and me in the blackness. I'm just going to quickly, because there's a little bit... and that was in 1976 when I first came to London. At the beginning of a year in which I would end up in a nightclub in Covent Garden, in a still derelict, dangerous Covent Garden. It's funny to think of Covent Garden as a dangerous place now, full of the sort of Mimax and God knows what, but it was a dangerous place. And at that point it was, so that's where I would end up. Sorry. Sorry, I'll find it out. At the beginning of the year, I'd stood on a railway platform dressed in a white school shirt, salvaged black evening waistcoat, trousers with satin seams and cracked patent shoes, my hair slicked back and sprayed gold, waiting to be conducted into a pitch-black arena where Kraftwerk's crackling radioactivity and the brutality of un chien andalou, in which an eye is sliced open with a razor, gave way to the sound of a relentless engine and the sight of the man himself, improbably teleported to an earthly stage, sunken-cheeked, too thin to be contained by the fluorescent cage of strip lights thrown around him. He'd arrived from Dover in a slam-draw train, to be driven from the station in an open-top car, like someone to rule us. In a bankrupt, blacked-out country with the power cut off and insurrection threatening, the whiteness of 2001 seemed far away. I felt I had been summoned to his presence, to the future. He was an incarnation, a self-portrait seen in a black glass. There he was, dressed in black and white, a packet of Gitan in his waistcoat pocket, a Prospero throwing darts in lovers' eyes as he quoted from The Tempest, singing of the stuff from which dreams are woven, bending sound, dredging the ocean, lost in his circle. I was alone with him in the darkness, overlooking that ocean. The cavernous auditorium in which he performed his apocalyptic cabaret was built as a swimming pool for the 1934 British Empire Games, 2 years before other games were conducted in another European capital. Cities connected by that same railway, that same past and future, that same deathly glamour. I had no idea that his opening song was inspired not by trains, but by the Stations of the Cross, although I always noticed the 2 crucifixes around his neck.
Thank you. I feel I have monopolised Philip's time, but we do have time for some questions. So if you have anything you would like to ask, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. Yeah, young lady.
Hi, thank you so much for being here, and I really like your jumper. I just wanted to say
Thank you. I wish I made these. I could sell so many. More books. Sell more jumpers than books.
Yeah. Or a deal of the two.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you because I was reading your book when I was just in the south coast of Portugal, and I was very lucky, and I decided to go surfing for the first time because I was halfway through, and your courage in going into the sea kind of inspired me to go, and so that was nice. You mentioned that when you went into the sea, or when you go into the sea, you consider yourself to be kind of a weak person, and I picked up on that, and I just wondered whether you could expand on that. Like, what makes you think of yourself as being weak?
When I suppose spending time with everything else in the water, it is a choreography, and we are so inept in the face of that choreography. The unity of the way the water is, the fact that when a whale hears us, there's no separation between the actual water and its eardrum. So the bigness of the whole of the ocean is intimately connected in a sensory form to that animal. We hear the water through another chamber in our ears. We're separated from the water, and that's a symbolic separation. Yet, we came from, the first experience we had was in the saline sea of our mother's belly. We first heard the world through water. And so I always feel weak because I'm pathetic, 8.5 stone weakling, obviously, but also because I have this kind of arrogance that, I own the world because I live on the land, and because I feel as though, when you come into contact with animals, it's that sense of context, and there's a sense of communion as well, because merely by tolerating your presence, the animal is creating a dialogue. And I absolutely believe that animals know that. They know that. And I think that kind of shames us in a way because of what we do to animals. And that's as I get older, I realise that the awful things we do to one another are absolutely connected to the awful things we do with the rest of the world. I mean, it's kind of an obvious thing, but it really strikes you, And so I suppose I feel weak because I feel morally weak and mentally weak. That all the things that I prize, and not my relationships to people, because I think those are very important things. And I think we don't. What astonishes me is to bear witness to the relationship of other animals. When I was in Sri Lanka in March, these 150 sperm whales, about 30 of them started moving really quickly towards the north. We're off the coast. We're 18 nautical miles out from Sri Lanka, and they started moving very fast towards the north. And we followed them. We thought we were going to witness this amazing sperm whale orgy, because they've been doing this all day. And you thought, wow, this is going to be a real gangbang. 30 big sperm whales. And so we got up to the point when they suddenly stopped and gathered around another group of sperm whales, and they lined themselves up like this, like logs, right next to each other. And it was astonishing. It was a huge, just mass, like a floating raft of these huge animals. And so we got back in the water. We thought, this is going to be amazing. Got into the water. And I was with my diving partner, Drew, and I said, look, Drew, there's dolphins with them as well. And we got down, we got halfway across to the whales, the sperm whales. We realised they weren't dolphins, they were orca, they were killer whales. And the killer whales were rounding up the sperm whales and attacking them. And the reason why the sperm whales had rushed towards that point is the females and calves had sent out a distress signal and summoned help, assistance. And for the next 2 hours, we watched out the playing of these two cultures in which our culture was watching, human beings were watching. And this was something which had nothing to do with human beings at all. So the intense intelligence of the 2 pods of orca that were attacking these sperm whales, 24 orca, circling, coming down underneath, trying to get up in the middle, because they couldn't take the big males. The males were like armies, like Roman war machine, like huge meter thick blubber. But they could get underneath and try and attack their calves. But what we realised as we looked down in the water, after we got out of the water very quickly, because the orca had attacked us, the orca actually peeled off and it started swimming towards us. So we got out of the water very quickly. But we realised from the GoPro camera we were using, and also what we'd seen when we were in the water, that the sperm whales were diving up and down like this to defend their young and their females, defend themselves. And yet, of course, the orca were exhibiting this extraordinary culture of honed attack, sea wolves, and it was incredibly humbling to watch this being played out for 2 or 3 hours, just watching this happening, and thinking this is going on all the time. We have no idea. Something about David Attenborough will film it, and everyone's, oh wow, amazing. But it's happening all the time. So it's nothing. But what was really strange was eventually the attack on the sperm whales stopped, and the orca seemed to be defeated by the presence of the males. And actually, to be honest, I was in tears, because I was seeing 2 of my favourite animals on Earth about to eat each other. So I was really glad when this sort of stopped, because it was getting the whales were pooing all the time to try and create a diversion to sort of cloud to their presence in the water. They were slamming they have these huge mouths of 42 the biggest teeth in the animal kingdom, kept slapping them opening shut like this. It was an astonishing thing. At the same time, you could hear the orcas whistling hunting whistles. It was incredible, such a physical thing. So the orca moved off. One pod moved off, completely left the scene, and another moved off sort of about 100 yards distant, a bit further actually. So we left the sperm whales thinking, oh great, the sperm whales are fine. So we went over to the orca, because they were doing a lot of surface activity. They were slapping and jumping up and down things. We got to them to watch them, because it was astonishing. These black and white, you see them so clearly through the water. You don't have to be in the water to see them. They're like so graphic, so the contrast is so intense. That's what scares their prey. That's why. And they were just amazing to watch them surfing alongside us. But then they started to surf around us, closer and closer, rammed us 5 times. And at one point I looked over one side of the boat, and we're in a 19-foot, like a tiny fiberglass fishing boat held together with sticking plaster. No life jackets, no rockets, no GPS, nothing. We were completely, in a just a tiny little fishing boat. And 5 orca came charging towards the side of the boat I was on, charging directly at it. I thought, fuck, that's it. That's what, I've never been the subject of attack by highly sentient animals. Highly sentient animals. You just really realise this is culture. This is another culture. It's coming for me. And they dove just at the last moment. But it's quite clear they used this same tactic to try and flip ice floes with seals on them, and they were using the same thing on us. So we basically skedaddled. We got out, but it's funny because we had a Sri Lankan scientist on board. There's only 5 of us on board. It was a tiny boat, but he had a hydrophone in the water, and he pulled it up, and it had been bitten off. I've never been given that kind of lesson. You are utterly insignificant. We're going to do what we like. And we only survived because they decided not to take us.
Which I think, unfortunately, is a lesson we have to leave it on. The lesson that you are all utterly insignificant. But I think there's a certain sense of hope there, perhaps. But I'm sure it has come across quite what an admirer I am of Philip's work generally, and this new book, Rising Tide, Falling Star, in particular. I really cannot recommend it enough. Buy copies for yourself. Buy copies for your family. It is the holidays coming up. We have plenty of them at the till. I'm sure Philip will be happy to sign them for you. Do stick around. Have a glass of wine with us as usual, and one more time please just join me in thanking Philip Hoare.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.